Today I'm going to recap an episode from the Crown series. It's from season 4, it's episode 3, and it's called Fairytale. The episode's called Fairytale, and right from the beginning we have an opening shot of a castle, and it's Windsor Castle. Outside the castle, we see Lady Diana Spencer climb into her little red Austin mini metro and drive off. Watching her from the window is our Prince Charming, Prince Charles, and he's holding a little toy soldier figurine, and he sets it down on the table next to him. Now, the writers of this show love to use symbols to illustrate a point, and in this case, that little toy soldier symbolizes that whatever just transpired between Charles and Diana was an act of duty. Now, this is confirmed in the very next scene where we see Charles call his mother and say, "I did it, it's done." Almost like he just finished his homework or something. At the same time, we see his sister, his aunt, and his grandmother all waiting by their phones. So it was kind of like this has been in the works for a while. Charles tells his mom, she said yes, and she said that it was the most happiest moment of her life. Aww, aww, aww. Congratulations. We then cut back to Diana, who's actually happy about being engaged, and she's driving back to London. She's busting out to Diana Ross's Upside Down. This song is actually about a wife who gets cheated on but stays with her husband anyway. Diana then pulls into her neighborhood and there's paparazzi everywhere. Diana's relationship with the paparazzi was strained for the rest of her life, and this is where it all started. She then goes into her apartment and her roommates are waiting for her. So now we know that Charles's family knew it was coming, the paparazzi obviously knew it was coming, and even Diana's roommates kind of thought it was coming. And they're like, well? And Diana responds with her little head nod. And everybody freaks out. And they all go out for a night out in the town. And so we know that for Diana, this is a really exciting moment, and for Charles, it's more of like duty. So this fairy tale is already kind of like, I mean, we do have a fairy tale. We get the castle, we get the prince, and we get the future princess. And there's even a shot of Charles's grandmother sitting on the couch waiting for the phone call, and a little mouse scurries across the floor in front of her, almost giving this like a Cinderella vibe. So then Diana gets to choose a ring. She actually gets to choose a ring. It wasn't given to her. She got to pick any one she wanted. The ring she went with was that sapphire ring that we all now see on Kate Middleton's finger. And she liked it because it's blue, color of my eyes, and also because it reminded her of her mother's engagement ring. Now remember, her parents divorced when she was a kid, and it really messed up her childhood. So it's kind of a weird choice. We then have a scene where Elizabeth is talking to her assistant, and the assistant says, listen, we gotta get her some royal classes. Maybe you should do it. It could be like from one queen to another. And Elizabeth's response is, no, I'm way too much of a softie. We'll have Lady Fermoy do it. Now, in case you forgot, Lady Fermoy is Diana's grandmother, the same woman that accompanied Diana as a chaperone on her first date with Charles to the opera. She kind of just stood in the background, like all creepy. We then see Diana back at her apartment with her roommates, and they're giving her the royal send-off. They're having a toast, and they're like, yay to no more paying rent, yay to no more cleaning your sister's apartment, because apparently that's what Diana used to do for extra money, which really gives it a Cinderella vibe. Yay to no more teaching kindergarten, and yay to one day being the queen. She walks out the door, walks down the stairs, and there's a shot from below looking up of her roommates. And slowly the camera flips 180 degrees. And it's kind of like Diana's world is being flipped upside down. As she's walking down the stairs, you'll notice that the walls are red. The production team actually said that they did this on purpose, and they painted the walls blood red. Well, they didn't say why, but I have my own theory. I think they did it because as she's walking down the stairs, she walks out the door and she's greeted by the bloodthirsty paparazzi. A little foreboding. We then see her get into the car and zoom off to the palace, and there's nobody there to greet her. She walks into her apartment in Buckingham Palace, and the only person who's there is her maid. She then goes down to dinner or drinks or whatever it is to see the royals, and they're like in this little royal powwow circle. And this is where you really see how unprepared Diana is, because she starts to cut through the circle to see Charles, and he stops her and he says, no, royal protocol. She then has to go around the circle and be like, Your Majesty, Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, Your Royal Highness, Your Royal Highness, Your Royal Highness, Your Royal Highness. And they're just like a pack of wolves surrounding her, just kind of snickering. The next day, Queen Elizabeth makes an announcement in Buckingham Palace to like the royal staff or something. I saw a couple chefs, so I have no idea. But she says, Lady Diana Spencer is set to marry the Prince of Wales. And everybody claps. We then see Diana and Charles being interviewed by a bunch of reporters. Now, this is that famous interview that Charles makes his first huge faux pas. The reporter says to them, You two seem very much in love. And Diana's response is, well, yeah, of course. And there's a pause. And Charles speaks up and says, whatever in love means. That sticks with him forever. You can Google that shit. We then see Diana and Charles walking back through Buckingham Palace, and he kind of veers off to the right. He's like, peace out. Diana asks, where are you going? And Charles responds, well, I gotta go back to Highgrove, his country estate, to pick up a few things before his month-long royal tour. So Diana just moved in, and Charles is like, peace out for a month. Diana's back in her room, and her ex-roommates are like, how is it? How's living at the palace? Have you had supper telly with the queen yet? Which I guess means dinner in front of the television. And Diana just responds, no, I've barely seen her. I'm actually kind of lonely. And also, did you see what Charles said in that interview today? And the roommates respond, yeah, no, it's probably fine. He was probably just embarrassed. The next scene, we have Diana and Charles at the airport. Now, they portrayed it a little different in the show than what happened in real life. In the show, they made it seem more like, oh, Diana's like, oh, I'm fine. It's cool. I'll just hang out at the palace by myself. And Charles says, oh, you can hang out with Camilla. And Diana responds, well, why would I do that? Diana said later in interviews that prior to this moment, she had been with Charles in his office when the phone rang, and it was Camilla. And so Diana excused herself and went out into the hall to give them some privacy, and she listened at the door, and she heard Charles say, I will always love you. Diana knew at this point that Camilla was still a part of Charles's life. The next day, we see Diana back at the palace, and she's having her first class with Granny. She has these royal etiquette classes, and it really makes you realize how much she has to learn. I mean, this engagement is more like a job opportunity. And she has to learn royal history, royal etiquette. At one point, Diana is learning how to give a public speech, and she's using her arms too much. And Diana's granny comes over and puts a rope around her to hold her arms down. And she says that Queen Mary used to do this with her ladies in waiting, and it would teach them to use their arms less when they spoke. When you use your arms, you show too much emotion. So there's this visual of just Diana like totally tied up. So something to remember is Diana's only 19, and she moves in with her boyfriend, and the boyfriend takes off for a month. So she has nothing to do at the palace. And they showed this by having her roller skating throughout the palace and listening to music. She takes ballet classes. This is important because it comes up later on in the season. And she just takes her classes with Granny and watches TV. At one point, this woman shows up, and she has like all these carts of mail. And Diana asks, what is all this? And the woman says, well, this is from the public. And this is cool because this is where you really see Diana being adored by the public. She was getting no attention from her in-laws. She was left alone in the palace. And it's no wonder why she grew into the people's princess. Because right from the beginning, the love and affection she got was mostly from the public. And this is where I think it really started to affect her mental health. They put this scene in where she walks down to the kitchen. They actually show this shot of her descending this spiral staircase, and it's almost like a slow spiral downward of her mental health. She gets to the kitchen where you see Cinderella's pumpkin. She opens the refrigerator door, and you see all these puddings and cakes and whatnot. And she starts to eat. We then cut to Diana in her bathroom leaning over the toilet. Now, I kind of wondered how they were going to portray this in the show, bulimia. And I don't really know much about it, but I will say that they really articulated how lonely it is. Diana actually said years later that when she made herself sick, it almost felt like a pair of arms were just wrapped around her. almost like she found it comforting. So Diana's back in her room and she's totally defeated and she's sad. And the only thing she does is watch TV. She barely answers her mail. She calls her ex-roommates and she tries to tell them this. And she says, listen, I barely see Charles. I barely see the Queen. I'm very lonely. It's like they just don't understand what she's going through. She looks down and she sees a letter. She picks it up. She reads it and it's from Camilla. The next scene, we have Diana meet with Camilla at a restaurant called none other than Menage a Trois. Now, what the director did in this scene was he actually planted the actor who plays Charles in between the actresses who played Camilla and Diana, because he wanted to create sort of like a tension, a tug of war. And Camilla just dives right in. It's like a pissing contest. I know everything about Charles. I know his neuroses. He likes an egg with every meal. He doesn't eat lunch. He loves to garden. Oh, Fred. And Diana asks, who's Fred? And Camilla says, oh, it's our nicknames for each other, Fred and Gladys. Ugh. Diana's just picking at her food, but she starts to eat faster and faster the more nervous she gets. And she points out that she's barely ever seen Charles. And Camilla says, oh no, you saw him at this time at Highgrove, and this time at Balmoral, and this time when you went to the opera. And Diana realizes that every single time she's hung out with Charles, he's run to Camilla to tell her. Camilla says to Diana, oh, where do you see yourself spending most of your time? London or the country? And Diana says, why do you want to know? And Camilla responds, just curious. Years later, in interviews, Diana actually said that she thinks the reason why Camilla asked her this question was to figure out where she could spend time with Charles behind Diana's back. So the check comes and Camilla says, I got it, I'm the more senior of the two. And Diana responds, no, let's go Dutch. To which Camilla responds, great, I'm all for sharing. Diana goes home and she copes the only way she knows how. We then have a shot of Diana looking at herself in the mirror, brushing her teeth, and you just see her tears coming down. But she kind of has this new sense of determination. She then goes to Charles's assistant's office and says, I gotta speak to Charles. And the assistant says, well, I can't reach him. Now, I hate this assistant, and you'll really start to hate him in later episodes. He's an asshole. And Diana says, no, I gotta talk to him. The assistant says, well, you can't. He's mid-flight. And Diana says, no, he's supposed to come back tomorrow. And then Diana looks down and her eyes catch something. And it's a folder and inside is a sketch. And she asks, what is this? And the assistant says, well, it's a bracelet, ma'am. And Diana's like, oh. Until she realizes what's on the bracelet. F and G. Fred and Gladys. Then Diana really freaks out, and you see her zooming up that spiral staircase, flies in through the door, and she tries to get the Queen on the phone, and she totally fails, and she screams at the operator, this wedding can't go through, this is just absurd, and she picks up a vase and throws it across the room, and it's just heartbreaking. The next shot we see is of Diana in her ballet leotard. I know that when Emma Corrin filmed it, they actually had something choreographed, and she asked the director, can I just improvise? Can I just make it up as I go? And it's beautiful. And it's to the song for a Guy by Elton John, who Diana had a close relationship with later on in her life. And Song for a Guy is essentially about death. And I think what this symbolizes here is the death of Diana's innocence, because she really transformed in this episode. This is no longer a fairy tale. We then have a shot later on of Charles getting off the plane, and he gets into his car and it's pouring rain, and he says to the driver, Highgrove. So now we know the reason why he didn't tell Diana that he was coming back that day, because he wanted an extra day to go up to Highgrove to see Camilla. And this is confirmed in the next scene where we see the silhouette of Camilla, and behind her is Charles getting into his car to leave. He gets into the car and they start to drive back to London, and in the background we have Service of My Love. Now, this is a patriotic song that is about what you will sacrifice for the good of your country. We then have a close-up shot of Camilla's hand putting out her cigarette, and next to her is the bracelet that he gave her. He gets back to London and goes into the church, and he walks down to the front, and you actually realize that the Service of My Love that was playing in the background is actually being sung by a choir at the church. It's the song that they're going to play at their wedding. Charles walks up to Diana and she says, I know what's going on. I saw the bracelet. He leads her out back to this small chapel where they can speak privately. I think this is one of the times that Charles was actually being very honest. And he tells Diana that the reason why he went to Highgrove to give her the bracelet was to say goodbye. He also went there to pick up a ring that had the insignia of the Prince of Wales on it. And he pulls it out of his pocket and he gives it to Diana. It's him showing his commitment to her. But at this point, Diana's totally broken down. I mean, she has bulimia, she's been alone for at least 4 weeks, and she closes the box and she goes back out to where everybody else is. The rehearsal starts and Diana walks down the aisle towards the front where Charles is standing with the priest. The priest says to Charles, do you take Diana to be your lawfully wedded wife? Yada, yada, yada. And Charles says, yeah. And they look at each other and it's just sad. Margaret sees this, and we know she sees it because in the very next scene, there's a little powwow between Margaret, the Queen Mother, and Queen Elizabeth. And then Prince Philip walks in and he's like, how'd it go? How was rehearsal? Elizabeth says, well, we think it went great, but Margaret thinks otherwise. And then Margaret goes into, when is this family going to learn their lesson? When are we going to stop making the same mistakes? When are we going to realize that we can't force marriages and forbid marriages? And then Philip goes into this bit about how Diana's only going to get more beautiful and more confident, and Charles is going to fall in love with her. And the Queen Mother says, oh, this is how it's always been done. And then you see Queen Elizabeth just sitting there quietly. Elizabeth then goes to find Charles, and as she's walking through Buckingham Palace, you see the fireworks going off outside, and it's like opposite from what's going on inside the palace. She gets to the room where Charles is, and she walks over, and she has one of those amazing, like, Elizabeth motherly moments that you so rarely get to see. And she goes into a story about how her own grandmother, Queen Mary, was set to marry the heir to the throne, Prince Charming. He died, but the royal family loved her so much that they convinced her to marry the younger brother, Prince Charmless. They didn't really hit it off at first, but they grew to love one another, and they were able to lead the country through World War I, and they provided the nation with stability when they needed it the most. It was all about duty. And Charles just looks at her with tears in his eyes. You can see the reflection of the fireworks off his face in his tears, and he just looks heartbroken. The next morning, the day of the wedding, we see Diana get out of bed, and there's like huge crowds outside already, and you just hear all this cheering. And you just feel the gravity of this day. Now, what's interesting about this is they actually didn't show the wedding itself. I don't know if it was like budget constraints or maybe they couldn't get enough extras together. It was during COVID. I have no idea. But what they did instead was they showed Diana and Charles getting ready, and in the background you hear the actual recording of what the Archbishop of Canterbury said at the wedding in 1981. And he's going on and on about fairy tales, and he says, "This is the stuff of which fairy tales are made. The prince and princess on their wedding day." They then cut to a shot of Charles looking like that little soldier from the beginning of the episode. He slowly lifts his head as the Archbishop says, "This is where the adventure begins." Blackout. Thanks for watching. Hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more videos like this.